Hello everyone, welcome back to my little tutorial series on how to make custom levels in Madness Project Nexus. Yeah, this part ended up taking a little bit longer than a week to push out. Yeah, and for that I want to apologize. To make it a long story short, I ended up getting caught up in some IRL shit and some deadlines for the Tower of Madness. But here we are nonetheless. And as mentioned before, we are also going to be covering how to link rooms between one another, how the layers work, and how most of the prefabs work. I don't know if we'll cover all of them here in this vid, but I'll try to get as many as I can. So with that being said, let's jump right into it. Now, in the previous tutorial, we just kind of skimmed over how most of this stuff functioned. Like I said before, part 1 only acted as a bit of an introduction on how this stuff works, and just kind of getting a grip on the basic fundamentals. And to better show how the layers and prefabs work, I went ahead and created another room right here, which we'll use most of, if not nearly all the stuff we're going to talk about here in this room. Now, a couple things I want to touch on before I link this room to the other one is that you can actually rename these rooms to whatever it is you desire, and it won't break anything. Actually, as a matter of fact, I think you can actually rename any of this, and it'll still work just fine. I don't know how true that is. I've never actually tried it, but if it's something you want to do, then yeah, you can do it. You can also copy these rooms and link them between one another, and they'll work just fine as well. But for this video, we'll just kind of stick with just the one. And if you're wanting the room to have like a top-down view or whatever, first off, go into the room layout here and change these zeros to ones. Now, what this does is that this allows the camera to move back and forth. Also, when you adjust the camera to where you want it to be, make sure this blue pointer thing right here is in the center of your camera view. Like I mentioned in the last vid, the camera target, good God, I cannot talk. The camera target essentially represents where your character stands in the camera view. And then lastly, you can also change the color of the shadows in your room. So, for this example, I'm going to change the shadows of our room to, a red, because why not? We'll cover this other stuff here in a later video when we'll utilize it for another room. But for right now, I've wasted enough of your time. Let's go ahead and link these two rooms together. So first off, you actually want to go through and name your doors. Now, this is a very important step to do because when you go to select the door you want the player to be sent to, you don't want to accidentally select the wrong one and potentially put them in a place they're not supposed to be yet. So once we get that done, we'll go ahead and swing over to our first room, select the door that we want, hit that dot there, and then select our door here. You can then do this to the other door and basically give the player the ability to move between these two rooms as they please, but that's mostly optional. But anyways, since we're here anyways, I figured I'd go over linked scenes as well, which you can actually use to send players from one scene to another, which you can do by basically putting the name of the scene here, which I'll do by basically copying and pasting the name of the scene here, and then putting the name of the door that the player first goes through in that said scene, if that makes any sense. Which I think is optional, but I'll just kind of put it here anyways. But that's pretty much how you link the two rooms together. And so, moving on to the layers. This is another important thing to understand because it affects how you and enemies interact and navigate the room that you've made. Now, going over to this drop down here, we have 21 different layers to mess around with, although you'll only ever really use 16 of these. So, starting with these first 5 here, from default to UI, you'll almost never use any of them. They don't really serve any purpose to making rooms and whatnot, so we're going to go ahead and skip them. And so now moving over to terrain, which is we actually used this one in the previous video, but in case if it slipped through your mind, it's basically used for floors, walls, and ceilings and whatnot. They basically stop everything from passing through, like enemies, ragdolls, projectiles, your crosshair, and among a bunch of other things, but you kind of get the point. And so, moving down the line, we also got debris, which I believe is used for stuff like rigid bodies and just objects you can kick around and whatnot. But we're not going to be adding that kind of stuff here in this tutorial, so we're going to go ahead and skip it for right now. And next down the line, we have interactives, which I like to use these for things like stairs and cliff edges, because the only thing that they're really going to stop from passing are you and enemies. But even then, you and other characters can still shoot, see other characters, and ragdoll launch right through them. So in this case, I'm actually going to add some interactive walls right around the edges of this room, basically to stop you and other enemies from falling off by accident, but you'll still be able to go through them as a ragdoll if you were to get launched off the edge. So real quick, I'm actually going to get this finished up. Give me 1 second. Alright, so with that out of the way, we're going to be moving on to obstacles, which it's basically terrain, only it doesn't block the line of sight between you and enemies. And so for me, I generally use it for stuff like slopes and elevated platforms, mainly because for me, whenever you put two different objects together with the terrain layer on both of them, characters will typically want to stay on the object they're currently on right now. They won't cross over from one to the other. So the obstacle layer basically allows them to do just that. So in this case, I'm adding some platforms and slopes to act like a sniping point or cover point or whatever, I guess you could say. So in that case, bear with me for a second while I finish this up. Alrighty, so with that taken care of, I'm going to go ahead and actually skip a little bit over to block aim. And the reason for that is, well, because these ramps and platforms are set to obstacle, our cursor will actually phase through them. And you'll end up shooting the ground instead of the guy trying to kill you. And obviously we don't want that. So what block aim does is that it collides with the cursor. So if I were to copy and paste these ramps, set their layer to block aim, and then disable their mesh renderer, that'll completely fix that issue. So with that taken care of, we're going to go ahead and move over down to terrain invis, which this is another fairly important one because you generally want to use this one for the fourth wall of your room, which is basically like the invisible wall that stops the player from running towards the camera and falling off the room. So anyways, what terrain invis does is that it stops the wall from receiving bullet holes, blood splats, and generally stuff that would otherwise obstruct your view as you're fighting for your life in your level. So with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and swing over to my fourth wall here and set the layer to terrain invis. Pretty much simple as that. So anyways, going over to GUI real quick. I'll be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure whether or not this can actually be used for building rooms, mainly because it's used for things like highlighting weapons and other interactable stuff. So I'll probably go ahead and skip this one for right now. And moving over to fence, this basically stops both characters and projectiles, like let's say rockets for example, from passing through. But it still allows enemies to see you through it and also shoot bullets through it as well. This is a layer I don't really use too often, mainly because I don't really use things like fences or prison bars or things of that nature all too often. But swiftly moving on, we've also got character block, which is basically an interactive, but you can't like ragdoll launch yourself through it. Now, this is a layer that I basically use to create invisible walls in like open or outdoor areas to kind of act like borders of the map. You could still shoot through them, but you just can't cross through them. It makes it feel more like you've hit the border of an area instead of like feeling like you're trapped inside an invisible box. But anyways, swinging over to decals next. Now, yeah, this one's pretty self-explanatory. They basically just act like decoration. So with that being said, I'm actually gonna slap in a plane real quick, scale it down just a bit, add in that decal layer, and then I'm actually gonna slap, let's say a blood texture onto here. Screw it. Which, by the way, if you're wondering how I managed to get all of this, on the modding resources doc, it lays a couple of files containing various assets and textures from the game itself for you to use. So you can go ahead and download those, extract the files, and then drag them into here for you to use to your heart's content. Good God, I can't talk. But anyway, staying on topic, we're going to move over to path block now. And this one involves waypoints in AI pathfinding. So real quick, if I were to go over here real quick and place down 2 waypoints like so, and then sandwich this path block box between the two, the connection between these 2 waypoints will then get severed. Now, this layer very much comes in handy when you're trying to stop enemies from accidentally walking straight into their demise, whether that be cliff edges, traps, pretty much just hazards you don't want them wandering into, if that makes any sense. But that's pretty much path block. Moving over to bullet block now, we have another layer that's pretty much self-explanatory. It basically blocks bullets and nothing else to my knowledge. Big shocker, am I right? Anyways, honestly, I can't really think of what this could possibly be used for. For me, I ended up making an entire room based around this layer, my custom level called the Tower of Madness. Where the room pretty much has a bunch of these orange window things all over the place, and basically they act as a bit of a stationary bulletproof shield that you could pass through, if that makes any sense. But really, that's the only use I can find for them right now. And so anyways, moving over to Event Zone now, I'm actually going to be honest, I have absolutely no idea what this one does. To anyone who does know, let me know what it does in the comments, and I'll be sure to pin it for everyone to see. But anyway, swiftly moving over away from that one, we're gonna go ahead and move over to a layer that I actually do know what it does, which is the terrain obstacle. The terrain obstacle layer blocks pretty much everything except for your cursor. So real quick, bear with me for a second. Here is an example of how a layer like that would come in handy. So let's just say I've got a massive crate right here, right? I'm right here, and around the corner are some goons and whatnot, right? So when I set this crate to terrain obstacle, it'll stop that crate from blocking my aim when I decide to go around the corner and blast them. Now, that might be a bit of an example, but hopefully that makes enough sense. But anyways, moving on to our final layer, we actually have sight block, which another one is, it's pretty self-explanatory. It blocks sight and pretty much nothing else, which actually I'll probably use this one to make a waterfall right here where you can hide behind, because why not? Give me 1 second. Alrighty, with that being taken care of, that pretty much is going to conclude our coverage on the layers for this video. And so before we move away from layers and make our way towards the prefabs, I want to go ahead and select all these things here real quick. Bear with me for a second. Okay, I think that's everything. And then I'm going to go ahead and set the tags to floor. For any object that you expect characters to walk on, you want to make sure they are set to floor, because, like I mentioned in the last video, it basically tells the games that characters can spawn and navigate around the room with them, if that makes any sense. But speaking of navigation, I figured the best prefab to start with would be waypoints, because they are one of the most important ones to add into your room. Now, if I had to best describe how waypoints work, think of it like a trail of lights that grunts will move from one to another to navigate an otherwise pitch black room. And for every waypoint that you place down, they'll be able to see more and more of what kind of room they're in and how they're able to navigate around it. Now, that doesn't mean you should place down like 1,000 of these things in your room. Don't do that. You are going to fry your PC by doing that. So instead, you want to place them around like corners or otherwise places that you might think enemies will get stuck on or run straight into their demise. So in my case, I'm placing waypoints at the top, middle, and bottom of these slopes. At least one on each of these little platform things. A couple between these two slopes on each side of the room, and then at least a couple more in the center of the room. Now, this sort of setup that I've got going on in my room thoroughly covers any and all places that they might get stuck on without going absolutely overkill on it. I mean, hell, this could still be pretty overkill for what I'm doing, and if I wanted to make it like maybe as simple as possible, I'd probably place down like eight of them around like around the perimeter or whatever, and then just put one in the center and call it good. But by doing that, the AI will not be able to navigate this room as easily. But regardless, finding that fine line between too little and too much is one that you'll master over time once you've experimented it with it enough. Good God, I can't talk. But before we move on to other point prefabs here, I want to focus your attention over to the inspector window for a second, because for every prefab that's in this favorites tab, they're gonna have a script component to them that makes them do, well, what they do. And for nearly all of them, we have options to customize them and make them do what we want them to do. So for waypoints, along with sniper points and spawn points, their scripts are very simple, so we'll go ahead and cover them real quick. So the first thing that will probably catch your eye first is the serial number. Nearly every single prefab is going to have this, and to best describe what it does in the simplest way possible, it's essentially used by the MAD card maker to make them function in either a certain way or at a certain time. But that's something I'll have to go more into detail in another video when we go over the MAD card makers. So for right now, just keep this option at the back of your head. So aside from that, we can also make it connect to very specific waypoints, which is pretty useful if you're wanting to make enemies follow a very specific path. Though, if you're going to use this function, definitely name all the waypoints that you're going to use, just so that way they don't get mixed up, and the AI using the path doesn't break on you, if that makes any sense. So aside from that, there's also the floating option. Now, typically you don't want to enable this option for waypoints. You always want to have your waypoints on the ground, or at the very least as close to the ground as possible, if you want the AI to work at its best. So the floating option is specifically utilized by the spawn point, but why that is, we will get to in just a little bit. But anyways, moving over to sniper point. Now, this is the kind of point that's specifically used by enemies that like to hang back, camp, and snipe at you from a distance. So in that case, I'm going to place one on each of these platforms just so that snipers can stay on them and attempt to snipe you on that elevated position. One thing I will mention too, while we're still on points, you may have noticed that between all three of these kinds of points, they all use the same script. So if you wanted to save a little bit of time and effort, or if you're like me, who went into the Scene Tools overview doc, looked at the pictures of the waypoint layouts, didn't bother reading any of the text around them, and thought they were proper ways of helping AI navigate around corners, you can fix this rookie mistake by selecting all the waypoints you want to change, going over to Snipe, and then selecting Waypoint. Super easy fix. But anyways, moving over to our final point, we've got spawn points. Now, despite being roped in with waypoints and sniper points, they're not actually used for AI pathfinding in any way, believe it or not. Instead, they're actually used to spawn weapons into the room you're in, which is where the floating option comes in. Waypoints snap to the ground by default, and by enabling this floating option, we're able to spawn weapons from the sky and have them drop down instead of like appearing on the ground or some crap like that. So now that leaves the question, how do we make weapons spawn from this spawn point? Unfortunately, that's something I'll have to explain in another video when we go over how Mad Card Maker works. I know, I'm sorry, but I promise it'll be one of the first things that we go over in the next video. But anyways, that's about it for the for the points. Let's go ahead and move on to zones now. So the first one that we've got in line are dead zones, and I'm sure you can imagine what these ones do. So starting from the bottom, we can adjust how much damage they do and how many corpuses they take from you. You can also have the zone apply a damage over time debuff on those who touch it. So say for example someone touched this zone, they can suddenly burst into flames to get turned into charcoal. Yes, you could do that with this zone. But how you do it, I'll have to go more detail into the next vid. But to keep it simple, if we were to go over to Mad Card Maker, we can go ahead and make a new Mad Card, track down the section called Damage Over Time, copy the name of the damage over time you want to inflict on people, and then paste it into this little section here. So aside from that stuff, we can also filter out who gets hit with damage, who gets insta-killed by the zone, and who all gets teleported to a door when they go into it. There's also the options for whether or not to make dead bodies vanish, whether dead bodies get teleported through a door or not, and whether or not to destroy weapons upon touching the zone. So for me, I'm going to be putting this zone down into the pit below using the setup that I've got here in the script component. Alright, so with our dead zone now installed, let's go ahead and move on to the next zone, which is spawn zone. Now, this one's pretty simple. This one spawns characters and enables squad spawners that are disabled by default. So going over to the character maker and the squad spawner, both of them give you the option to disable spawn, which can then only be enabled through either the event system in the Mad Card Maker or, in this example, the spawn zone. As of right now, I don't really have much of anything in this room for this zone to enable. So as of right now, I'm just going to shrink it down a bit and just place it in the center of the room. But we will be coming back to this zone briefly. So next up, we have the off-limits zone, which kind of functions like the dead zone, but remove the, well, dead part. This zone's main purpose is to teleport those to a door whenever they touch the zone. And as you can imagine, it's generally used to get you and enemies out of areas they're not supposed to be in. So, much like the dead zone, we have the ability to filter out who is affected by this zone, along with the option to destroy weapons. What makes this zone different, however, is not only the ability to add an effect when you and enemies get teleported out of this zone, but also the fact that you can send the player and enemies through random doors if you have more than one added to this list here, which we can expand by making this higher than 1. By the way, the doors added to this list don't have to be exclusively in this room, meaning you can also send yourself to completely random rooms throughout the scene itself. So in my case, I'm going to add this zone outside the room here, place down another door, set it to empty, rename it to randomized door, slap that into the center of the zone, and then connect that to the randomized door. Alright, I'll probably leave it at that for right now. Alright, so moving on to our next zone, we have the Get Out zone, and as you can see, this one is a little unique. So what this zone essentially does is that whenever a character touches this big zone here, it'll force that character to move into this smaller one here. And going over to its script, we've got a fair amount of options to play with. So starting at the top, we've got My Collider and, skipping over a little bit, Safe Zone. These two options ask for something to act as a big zone and the little zone, which has already been done in this prefab, so really you'll probably never even touch these options. But the reason I even bring them up in the first place is because as we go through these prefabs, you may notice a trend where some of these scripts will ask you for an object to act as a component for the thing it's trying to do. But why these are even options in the first place, I'll have to go into more detail later when we go over to the customizable prefabs here. But moving on, we of course have a filter on who gets affected by this zone, along with options for whether or not characters move over to the little zone the moment they touch the big zone, whether or not they dodge over to that little zone, or whether or not NPCs stop trailing you. We can also make them run into that little zone and also affect all states, meaning the big zone will make characters go into that safe zone regardless if they're, let's say, ragdoll, running into it, I don't know, doing a half mag punch into it. You kind of get the point. It doesn't really matter. And then finally, we have options for whether or not it affects NPCs that are leaving the room through a door, or whether or not enemies are engaging in combat. And then lastly, it has clear orders in NPCs. Like, for example, an NPC is trying to pick up a weapon that happens to be inside the big zone. This option will stop this NPC from trying to pick up that weapon that's inside the zone and potentially getting them stuck in an endless loop. Anyways, if I had to be honest with you, I don't really have a place to put them in right now. I could put them along the edge in our arena to stop enemies from walking off the edge, but the interactive walls already do a good enough job at doing just that. So for right now, I'll just go ahead and delete this. But anyways, moving over to the next zone, we have the event zone. Unfortunately, this is another one I'll have to skip for right now, simply because it's another prefab that's tied in with the Mad Card Maker. But swiftly moving over to Camera Zone, we've got a zone that uses 3 different objects, which is, well, the zone itself, duh, a camera, and also a waypoint. So what the waypoint does in this prefab is that it basically acts as a bit of a dollar store camera target from the room layout prefab here. And just like the camera target, you typically don't want this waypoint outside of your camera's view, otherwise it'll cause the camera to act funky and out of place. But moving over to its script and starting from the top, we've got Am Active, which dictates whether or not this zone is enabled or disabled by default. We've also got Priority, which is used for when you have like multiple of these zones enabled in one place. The higher the number, the higher the priority this zone will be, which goes from like the largest number first to the smallest number last, I believe. Anyways, we've also got Ignore, which when multiplayer, which basically disables this zone whenever you're doing multiplayer in your level. Next up, we also have Transition Frames, Stationary Modifier, and Influence options, which I'm gonna be honest with y'all, I have absolutely no idea what these do. Comment down below if you do, because I don't really use this zone all too often. But what I do know what works is the Axis options, which, much like the room layout, controls what direction the camera moves. So X does left and right, Y does up and down, and Z does back and forth. The snap options basically teleport the camera from one place to another instead of just moving from point A to point B, if that makes any sense. The distance cutoff is basically the render distance for the camera in this zone, which I guess has an option to adjust it based on aspect ratio. Another feature, I don't know what it does. Now, if I were to put this zone somewhere, what I may do is add a little secret here beyond the waterfall that has, like, I don't know, like a rocket launcher or something. So bear with me for a second. I'm going to do a little bit of building real quick. Alright, so with that being done, there is one more thing that I do want to mention about the camera zone real quick. Like I mentioned in the previous video, in order for a lot of these prefabs to actually show up in the game, they need to be dragged directly into the room layout. However, the camera zone is one of the very few exceptions to this rule. Instead, you actually need to drag it into the waypoints folder, which I'll go ahead and do real quick, just so that way it's out of the way. Actually, now that I think about it, I'll go ahead and just kind of drag everything else into it, just to kind of clear up some space. So give me 1 second. Alright, so with that out of the way, that pretty much covers all of the zones that we have for right now. And now we're going to be moving on to markers. Although we've already covered most of them in a previous video, we did skim over some of the features in their scripts, so we'll go ahead and cover them now. So starting this off, we're going to cover both the player start and the character start at the same time, mainly because their scripts they have the very same options despite doing very different things. So starting from the top, we have spawn enabled. I mean, self-explanatory. And then we also have factions, which, believe it or not, there's actually a bit more to them than you might think, but that's something we'll have to cover in another video. We also have awareness, which affects the behavior of the character. Well, that is if you're not the one playing it. But hitting that drop down, we've got unaware, which makes the character unaware of your existence until they spot you. Hunting makes them aware of your existence, but not exactly your location, so they'll basically search for you. Combat makes them aware of your existence and location, but you're still able to lose track of them. And then lastly, match makes them able to track where you are without ever losing track of you. So anyways, chatter makes the characters say a line after they spawn. You can make them do a little animation upon saying the line, though how you do that we'll cover in another video. We can also delay how long it takes for them to say the line, play it during combat, and also have it either show up as a cutscene, you know, that little window in the top left corner where it shows the face of the character and then the dialogue next to it. Or we could just simply have it like a simple text above the character itself. And patrol params, we've got patrol paths, which is how many paths in total this character can use. Path points are, well, the paths themselves. Now, by default, the characters will always follow the waypoints in the room that they're in. But I typically use this for whenever enemies end up losing track of me, so at that point they'll resort to following the path as a way to find me. Aside from that, we also have options like follow leader, which will cause characters to follow the one with the highest level. But what that means we'll have to cover in another video. Loot path is pretty self-explanatory. Never wander dictates whether or not enemies will stay on the patrol path whenever they're unaware of the player. And generate return path creates a path for a character to get back on the main path whenever they're no longer engaging in combat. So next up we've got character assignment, which we've already covered most of this in the last video. However, I do want to correct something I got wrong on the Mad Card Maker. Although this is another thing that's also tied to Mad Card Maker, what this actually is basically where you would put the Mad Card of your custom character, and the character drop down is basically what the prefab will default to in case if, for any reason, the custom character fails to load. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and move over to gear, which in order to fully understand this one, we'll need to jump into Mad Card Maker for just a second. Now, in the previous video, I did mention that nearly all Mad Cards for weapons can be found in Mad Card Maker, so I'll go ahead and show you where that is real quick. So, in the main menu, we're going to select our mod and hit the cog icon. We're then going to select our deck and hit the plus sign. From here, we're going to click on select card type. And out of the 4 options here, we're going to select the one that we want and then click on this bottom drop down here. From here, we're going to select a weapon, go over to the name of the Mad Card here, copy it, then going back over to Unity, we're going to paste it into one of these fill-ins here. Aside from that, we have the clear default weapons. I mean, kind of self-explanatory. And we also have key cards, which again, I'll be going over in another video. But moving on to traits and behaviors, good God, these things are an entire beast in their own rights, which unfortunately I'm not going to be covering in this tutorial series, not only because going over each and every one of these will literally take me hours to do, but almost none of them have anything to do with actually making custom levels outside of the options that you see here. But if you're wanting to know what each and every one of these do, the Mad Card Maker does a pretty good job at describing what every single one of them do. But aside from that, we have also got a couple of options here. Invincible to player squad and fixed in place. I mean, they're pretty self-explanatory. Essential makes it to where the character takes less damage from things like falls and executions, along with stopping their corpses from disappearing after a while. And then permanent squad mate dictates whether or not they can even be revived. And then for our last option, we can have the players spawn from a door instead of appearing out of thin air, basically. So that basically covers both the character start and the player start. I'm not 100% sure if any of these options will actually affect the player character, given that that is if you're playing this through a playground level. Frankly, I haven't really messed with this all that much, but feel free to try out for yourself. But anyways, moving on to boss start. I won't cover much of what this one does, not only because a lot of it's stuff we've already covered, but it also uses things that's yet again tied to Mad Card Maker. What I can cover, however, is the option for the boss to say something every time they lose a corpus, which I'm probably actually going to add a boss into this room. Give me 1 second. Oh yeah, and circling back over to our spawn zone again, I'm going to go ahead and add our boss to it, so that when the player reaches a certain point, it'll spawn him in. And what better way to lure players into this zone than with a weapon? Which brings us over to item spawn. Now, in terms of options, we can, of course, add in whatever weapon into this, give it some extra mags if it's a gun, have it fall from the sky if we wanted to, or we can even send it flying across the room. But that's about it in terms of options for the item spawn, aside from spawn into the parent, which I have no idea what it does, to be honest. But anyways, with that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and move over to squad spawner once again. Now, although we've already covered a good majority of all this in the previous video, there are some options in this script we did not cover. So starting with never-ending waves and spawn during cutscenes, pretty self-explanatory. And then we also have ignore faction enemy count or ally count, which basically removes the counter for how many enemies are left in the spawner. Spawn requirements and restrictions. This basically dictates whether or not the spawner can start spawning stuff whenever there's an enemy from that faction present in the room, or if they end up spawning the player. So in terms of requirements, let's say for example, a Nexus agent spawns in by me touching this zone here or whatever. Because that Nexus agent is now here, the spawner can now do its thing. Or if we make it to where the presence of this Nexus agent, a restriction, we would need to kill this agent before the enemies start pouring in. As for enemies being alerted, if we were to make it a requirement, the Nexus agent would need to see me before enemies can start spawning in. Or if it's set to a restriction, the enemy would need to, I guess, lose track of me before the spawner does its thing. I'm not entirely too sure on that one, but that's basically what those do, I think. Regardless, we're going to be moving over to custom squads now, which compared to the normal wave system here, we have full control over the entire wave system down to the individual enemies themselves. We can control how many waves of enemies we can spawn, what order they spawn in, and how many enemies we can spawn per wave. In custom squads, we can fully customize the enemy from the gear that they're wearing to the weapons that they're holding, and of course we can even add our custom character here, which by the way, this red bar here in the unit section is also a place for custom mad cards to go in. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and fill some of these in for a second. Give me 1 second. Alright, so with that being done, that should be everything covered for the squad spawner. And moving on to our final marker, which is the dummy. Again, this is another one I'll have to skim through, mainly because this one is tied in with not the Mad Card Maker, but actually Blender and Unity animation, because this marker consists of a character doing animations. So starting off with additional armor, pretty self-explanatory, you add armor to the character, but then we have uniforms. Now what this one does is that it basically makes the dummy randomly pick from a stockpile of armor you selected, along with giving it custom colors and alternatives for both styles and textures for selected armor. Aside from that, there's also the option to dictate whether or not the dummy has collision and whether or not you can hit them at all. Alright, so with markers out of the way, it's time to cover our final set of prefabs, which are proxies. So to start things off, we are straight up skipping over cover simply because of how stupid simple they are. I mean, look at this. It's literally a serial number and the type of cover it is. So moving over to doors once again to cover the rest of his options, starting off with the locked option, pretty self-explanatory, but it is worth mentioning that the only way to get this door to unlock with this enabled is by using the event card from, well, you guessed it, Mad Card Maker. Vocations are pretty interesting. These two options dictate whether or not characters with these vocations can go through these doors. And if you're wondering what vocations are, some of these names might be a little familiar to you. Hacker, Demolition, Zed, Mag, I mean, you get the picture. Though, surprisingly, there's actually a little more to these vocations than you might think. Though, we'll have to cover them in more detail in another video. And so, moving on to more options. We can dictate whether or not enemies can go through this door. We can disable the previous room if we come out of this door. We can dictate whether or not this door becomes locked while enemies are in the room, and the other two options are pretty self-explanatory. Though intangible is probably one that I'm not entirely too sure what it does. But moving on, we are going to be skipping locker, mainly because the script it uses is pretty simple, and we've already covered everything in it. And as for interactives and toggleables, we are also skipping because, well, like some of the stuff that we've talked about, both of them are deeply tied in with the Mad Card Maker, which leaves us to our final proxy, which is the Playground Control Room, which thankfully has a pretty simple script. Both options basically dictate whether or not you want a window, whether or not you want the window covered, and whether or not you want to give the room scaffold legs. Actually, now that I think about it, I've got a better idea for this room, secret room. Give me 1 second. Alright, so that's about as far as I can go on prefabs for this video. We've gone through a pretty decent amount of them, and in the next video we are going to be covering the event card system and how they're all tied in with about half of these prefabs. Along with covering the rest of them that we did not cover, such as the customizables, the door lights, potentially cutscenes, and a bunch of other stuff. But until then, I want to go ahead and thank everyone following this tutorial for being so patient. I know it took way longer than a week to get out, and once again, and I do apologize for that. But hopefully this has been at least somewhat helpful in understanding how a lot of this stuff works. But until then, I shall see you guys next time. Hopefully sooner than later.